In 2018, we reviewed the RetroTINK 2X, a lag-free line doubler that we felt was an exceptionally practical and versatile device. Through the intervening years, creator Mike Chi has kept his product lineup fresh, ultimately replacing the original 2X with the 2X Mini, the 2X SCART, and the 2X Pro. Thanks to their lower cost and ease of use, RetroTINK products have continued to be our first recommendation for anyone looking to dip their toes into the world of playing original consoles on modern displays. Mike's latest device keeps the simplicity that RetroTINK is known for while upping the feature set to a staggering degree. And we put it through its paces thanks to the units that Mike was able to send our way ahead of release. You ready for this? The next generation of scaling devices begins now. Now this amazing piece of hardware is sold in Japan by a company called Micomsoft.
Back in 2014, when we first shared how we used the FrameMeister to get crisp pixel video capture from real game consoles, it seemed to open a lot of people's eyes to the world of RGB gaming. But the price was a major sticking point. I've always justified it to myself this way. Yes, $300 or so is a lot of money, but it's at the low end of what you'd expect to spend on a new console or graphics card. So pretty similar to other products that promise an enhanced gaming experience. And since I enjoy using original hardware, it was worth it to me, but your mileage may vary. Products like the open source scan converter and the RetroTINK 2X series largely came about because the classic gaming public was hungry for lower cost alternatives to the FrameMeister. It's hard to go wrong with any of them, but each has pros and cons. The RetroTINK 5X, then, is the answer to those cons, giving us some serious dream features. But to pull it off, we're back to looking at a $300 device. Is that worth it to you to get higher compatibility with TVs and capture cards, proper motion adaptive deinterlacing, and seamless 240p to 480i resolution switching? If you've been in this scene for a while, you'll know that all of that is a big deal. So let's see just how well it gets the job done. The RetroTINK 5X looks like your average unassuming piece of AV equipment with its rear ports and translucent smoke-colored case. It supports composite, S-video, component, and RGB inputs alongside HDMI output. We haven't seen this much connectivity built into a single device since the FrameMeister. While it does lack the VGA input of the OSSC or GBS control, there are ways around this. For Dreamcast, I use a SCART cable from Retro Access, which uses a board designed by Dan Kuntz, which can be switched between 15 kHz and VGA content. So even without a VGA input, I can still connect all of my console's highest quality analog signals directly to the RetroTINK 5X. While the compact design helps save space, the downside is that you'll need to think a bit about how you route certain signals due to shared ports. The component Luma port doubles as the composite input, and the RCA audio inputs are used by composite, S-video, and component. In addition, the direction of the SCART input seems, well, kinda backwards. Apparently a necessary evil due to parts availability. Our best suggestions are to either use a flat SCART cable or turn the unit 90 degrees clockwise on the right-hand side of your setup, in which case the included remote should still be able to reach it just fine. While it may lack the capability for extreme customization, I feel that this is actually a good thing. You are simply presented with a lean but smart selection of options that takes you straight to the type of scaled image I'm always looking for. And the results are fantastic. We are so happy to see that the RetroTINK 5X compares very favorably against the FrameMeister and OSSC when using high-quality RGB or component cables. However, as usual, analog artifacts like jail bars may still be visible in backgrounds that use certain flat colors on specific systems like the Sega Genesis and PC Engine, in which case the consoles themselves need internal mods if you're looking for a more perfect picture. Of course, one perk to the RetroTINK products over the OSSC is that they're not just about the highest quality inputs, which is why they're so easy to recommend to people who might be reluctant to mod consoles like the NES, Turbo Duo, 3DO, and N64 for RGB output. People who just want a better way to hook up their N64 can also do so very easily with the RetroTINK 2X Mini and the included S-Video cable. And Mike's handling of composite video has always been the best of anything we've ever tested. One setting you should check when using composite video is the YC filter. Most systems should look cleaner with the 4-line comb filter, especially the NES. But as noted in the RetroTINK 5X manual, fans of the Sega Genesis composite look might want to try the notch filter instead. Supported input resolutions are 240p, 480i, 480p, and their PAL equivalents, with 720p and 1080i offered as a nice bonus. And this is a really great situation because aside from the 2X Pro multi-format version, the lack of support for 480p input in previous RetroTINK products made it so that people who use 480p content couldn't use one as an all-in-one solution for connecting all of their old consoles to their HD TV. But now, not only can you connect 480p sources, but you can get them beautifully line doubled and even line tripled. And 480i, Corey's gonna go in depth on that one later in the video, but this is the 480i deinterlacer we've been waiting for. As for 720p and 1080i, the color bandwidth on those does have to be downsampled from 444 to 422. But the result is still a really nice 720p pass-through, which is great for, say, 720p from certain Xbox games or for capturing your PS3 via component cables if you don't have an HDCP stripping HDMI splitter. I think the most exciting potential use case for 1080i is to take a lag-free HDMI to component converter to connect a custom firmware PlayStation TV to the RetroTINK 5X, and use the sharp scale hack so that a nearest neighbor integer scale fills the 1080i output, which the RetroTINK in turn converts to 1080p. With PSP games in particular, this can look really fantastic, perfectly filling a 1080p screen. The RetroTINK 5X also supports a pretty absurdly comprehensive set of output resolutions from 240p, yes, 240p, 480p, 720p, 768p, because most old 720p LCD TVs are not actually 720p, all reliable 1080p, and to truly earn its 5X moniker, 1200p and 1440p. Wait. 1440 divided by 240.
Spoiler warning.
The RetroTINK 5X was the RetroTINK 6X all along? Anyway, I suspect that the 1440p mode was added either much later in development, or maybe Mike just didn't want to treat it as the main feature since it is much less compatible than the other modes. But it's the trio of 1080p output modes that are clearly meant to be the stars of the show, since that is the most compatible resolution among screens in use today, but is also a tricky resolution for scaling up to, since neither 240p or 480p can be integer scaled to fit 1080p exactly. 1080p fill is the default resolution, and if 1080p is the best resolution for your equipment, my personal recommendation would be to use this for nearly all situations. This mode does not use an integer scale, but still manages to look crisp thanks to some excellent interpolation. Mike tells us that he opted to include this 1080p fill mode instead of supporting the non-standard 960p. Since the end result on your TV is fundamentally the same as 960p in terms of sharpness and sizing. For those who would like an even larger picture and maybe just a hair more sharpness, 1080p over mode is a 5x integer scale within a 1080p frame, which means some pixels will have to be chopped from the top and bottom. However, games from the analog era typically keep important information like the heads-up display far enough away from the edges so that they wouldn't be lost in a CRT's overscan area. So from that perspective, this could be the most authentic sizing mode overall. Some games have thick letterboxing that isn't even cut off at this level of zoom, so this mode really shines in those situations. And for any games that may have important info cut off, you can tap up and down on the remote to adjust the height so that it will work. I suspect that Mike considers this to be the canonical 5x mode that the unit is named after, more so than the 1200p mode. 1080p under mode is a 4x scale within the 1080p frame, and as a result is a bit on the small side. In addition, we noticed that the aspect ratio seems to be incorrect when using this mode. We figured it was a glitch, but Mike said that there is a reason for this. It's because the sample rate at this size exactly matches up with certain 480p sources, so it may allow for extremely sharp results, albeit at a somewhat incorrect aspect ratio. So basically, 1080p under mode is not terribly useful for regular gameplay, but may have niche applications in recording. However, you may be able to push things even further if you have the right TV or capture card. 1200p from the OSSC has usually worked great for us on our 4K OLEDs, so it's little surprise that the RetroTINK 5X turns in some fine results here too. But something truly magical happens if you have the means to push the RetroTINK 5X beyond even that and go for 6X. A video frame of 1920 by 1440, which is indeed a 4:3 aspect ratio. Unfortunately, despite being a pretty popular PC resolution, it seems that 4K OLED TVs did not support 1440p back when we bought ours, although we hear that the latest models do. But I was just dying to see what 1440p from the RetroTINK would look like on actual native 1440p monitor. And I wanted a new PC monitor for my retro room anyway. So I bought what seemed like a decent mid-range model and would you just look at this? Real consoles line sextupled from 240p to 1440p. Yowza! All I had to do was set the monitor to not stretch it, and it just plops that 1920 by 1440 right in the middle there real nice. I am loving how 1440p looks. And luckily, I can capture it with my 4K Magewell card too. So that's why this episode is edited and uploaded in 1440p if you hadn't noticed. But as I think should already be pretty clear by now, you don't have to have the equipment to push it this far in order to get incredible results. 1080p performance is nearly just as impressive. The RetroTINK 5X allows you to choose full range or limited range HDMI output. Remember, choosing full range just because it sounds better does not gain you anything if it's the wrong choice for your equipment. If dark scenes look too dark, see if limited range fixes it. Or if black levels look washed out, then that's a clue that you should be using full range in your setup. The RetroTINK 5X does also have a low pass filter or LPF setting, which in ideal situations you should be able to turn off, but it might not be a bad idea to just leave it on. It could soften the image by an almost imperceptible amount, but it may also make the picture a little cleaner. The goal of a low pass filter is to target unwanted analog noise and make it less visible. But don't get your hopes up thinking this just means you can get away with buying the cheapest component cables or something, because it's not really helping much with the noisy gray areas in this example. However, the LPF does slightly clean up my PC Engine's jail bars, which are especially noticeable in specific shades of blue. I've also found that using optimized sampling modes can at times accentuate analog noise, which the LPF may be able to alleviate to some degree. Speaking of which, the pixels you've been seeing throughout this episode, they are sharp, right? But let me ask you, if I hadn't just now shown you the difference between generic 4.3 and optimized sampling, would you have otherwise noticed that everything up to that point was just a touch soft on the horizontal axis? Does optimized sampling really add all that much? And are there drawbacks to using it? I mean, I'm not afraid to admit, we'd been using the FrameMeister for a good while before I ever learned about how the pixels in 4:3 aspect ratio games are actually not square. It just never occurred to me that the pixels I was looking at on CRTs and on my FrameMeister were often wider than tall, or vice versa, depending on the system. And that was the magic of interpolation that was giving us a crisp pixel look while still maintaining the 4:3 aspect ratio, but without the blight of scrolling shimmer. But I still perceived crisp pixels, even as I was somewhat unknowledgeable about what the FrameMeister was serving up, or the generic 4:3 sampling on the OSSC. So, optimized sampling. On the OSSC, you kinda have to work for this. Basically, what happens is you fiddle with a bunch of scary looking numbers, and if you do it exactly right for the specific console you're using, the pixels will have pin sharp edges along the horizontal axis. It is a pain in the butt to get it just right without any stray flickering pixels, but some people are extremely dedicated to the craft of optimal OSSC timings. And that's cool. And for those people, and maybe also for the ones who like the idea of optimal sampling but are just too lazy to use them, the RetroTINK 5X has a similar feature that, for them, may be one of its biggest selling points. The horizontal sampling option has a number of settings to flip through that list various consoles alongside a specific horizontal resolution. The idea is that if you're playing a game on that console, which is also running at that resolution, then you can get those razor sharp pixel edges with hardly any hassle at all. Certain systems may output multiple resolutions. For example, most Genesis games are 320 pixels wide, but not all, so if you do want to do this, you need some knowledge of what resolution each game runs at. Firebrand X has a handy cheat sheet of Genesis games that run in 256 pixel wide mode. PS1 is even more complicated, but 3 of its resolutions are already supported for RetroTINK 5X optimal timings. Super Nintendo in particular is a tricky one. Optimal timings just aren't going to look very good with most SNES consoles because the system's output is just so blurry. This mode only really works properly with the later one-chip consoles or an RGB modded junior console, since the output is so much sharper from those. So just use the generic 4:3 mode if you have a non-one-chip SNES. Despite not being officially supported, the optimized 256 sampling mode seems to mostly work for NES, but it seems to sometimes struggle to hold its lock on it during certain screen transitions. In fact, truth be told, I never got into the whole optimal sampling thing on the OSSC, which is rather shocking to some people, but on both the OSSC and RetroTINK 5X, I personally prefer to use the generic sampling modes. Why? Because getting perfectly sharp pixel edges while maintaining a 4:3 aspect ratio is simply not possible without way more display pixels. Generic sampling uses sharp horizontal interpolation to maintain 4:3, and it looks so good that I have a hard time believing you'd ever actually notice it's a tad less sharp once you pull your nose off the screen, sit on your couch, and actually play the danged game. The optimized modes basically round up to an integer scale so that you can have that hard pixel edge. It might be close to 4:3, but it's drifted just a bit further from it. Aside from the extreme ease of use of activating these settings, those who are already deeply into optimized sampling should be advised that the RetroTINK would probably not really be considered a straight upgrade over the OSSC in this regard due to how it has to sample color internally. It's something you can really only see with extreme zoom in, but on generic 4:3, the two are very hard to tell apart. Now, there are arguments to be made in favor of a non-4:3 aspect ratio, such as circles and squares sometimes not looking quite so circular or square in 4:3. And with the RetroTINK 5X's optimized 320 pixel wide mode for Genesis, you can get this square pixel aspect ratio. The same can't be said of SNES though, which if you're a fan of square pixels and 256 pixel wide games, that currently does not seem to be possible since the optimized mode makes the image just a hair wider than 4:3. But there is one situation in which even I would vouch for a square pixel setting on SNES, Super Game Boy. It would be lovely to see an extra zoomed in square pixels optimized mode just for playing Game Boy games on SNES if that could be implemented in a future update. All that said, the boost in sharpness from optimized horizontal sampling can be transformative in some situations, most notably with the N64, where you can take S-Video from an unmodified console and get something that nearly looks like an RGB or HDMI mod with deblur. The N64's anti-aliasing even helps hide some of the sampling errors that occur due to the softer nature of S-Video and the system's own blurry output. So just because optimized sampling ain't so much my thing doesn't mean that you shouldn't see if it gives you a result that you do like. So yes, automatic optimized horizontal sampling is a nice feature for those who want it, but just know that you will never be wrong if you simply leave it set for generic 4:3, and honestly, your pixels will still look oh so sharp. Now, the interpolation setting is sharp by default. This is good. No shimmering to be found in this episode. The alternative here is soft interpolation, which to my eyes doesn't work as well as the smoothing filter on the older RetroTINK 2X products. Maybe we could see some expanded settings on the 5X in the future, because some people do like to use smoothing on early 3D games specifically. Scanlines. I'm fairly impressed with the first option, polyphase 50%. Usually scanlines have to be used with a vertical integer scale or else they'll look uneven, but these work great on all output modes. Polyphase 90% is a bit on the dark side, I'd say, and so is integer 100%, which is sharper but will look uneven with non-integer scaling modes. In short, the RetroTINK 5X gets you a great picture just about no matter what you do, and you don't need to really worry about whether you can get it to work with your TV or capture card. But now I'm going to hand it over to Corey so we can talk about some of the more exotic features of the 5X that make scaling nerds like us very, very happy.
The OSSC and RetroTINK 2X series handle 480i deinterlacing with a bob technique, which is easy to implement without introducing input lag. But most people really don't like how it looks. 480i is also notorious for ruining the fun whenever it shows up unexpectedly in 240p games. The GBS Control had recently shown that it's possible to avoid these issues, but it was never intended to be a reference quality device. It's no exaggeration to say that we've literally been waiting our entire YouTube careers for a high-end scaler that treats 480i just as well as 240p and switches between the two seamlessly. Enter the RetroTINK 5X. A whopping 6 deinterlacing modes are offered. Here you can see Bob, Linear, and CRT Simulate modes. Let's slow them down so you can see how they work more clearly. Bob is just the same old Bob we all know and tolerate. Linear is a softer form of Bob, while CRT Simulate throws in empty scanlines every other field. But unfortunately, it's super dark. Be warned that some screens, particularly certain IPS screens, tend to temporarily retain alternating patterns. It should go away, but it's definitely kind of scary. Weave and Blend will probably be more popular than any of the bobbing modes. This is how they behave in motion. It's not ideal, since you can see the comb tooth artifacts on Weave and ghosting on Blend. More likely, you would choose these if you wanted a relatively static interlaced image, like a 480i title screen or menu to look really crisp and clean. But motion adaptive deinterlacing is where the real action is. This is what you probably think of as regular deinterlacing since it's similar to what your TV can do, but that's usually really laggy and doesn't always look so good for games. Motion adaptive deinterlacing uses more complex processing techniques based on the actual image content to essentially turn interlaced video into something that looks like it was progressive to begin with. This is especially important for the PlayStation 2, which runs at 480i for a vast majority of titles, and the RetroTINK 5X is now our undisputed favorite new way to record PS2 games. In fact, we would say that the RetroTINK 5X's handling of 480i is easily the device's #1 selling point over more affordable scalers like the OSSC. The illusion of motion adaptive deinterlacing can break down in very specific instances. We always use the flicker when your character respawns in Contra Shattered Soldier to show this, which happens on every motion adaptive deinterlacing process we've ever seen. Since the process largely relies on motion to work its magic, sometimes a sudden change in image content may cause a brief artifact. Notice how there's a slight jolt as each item in the menu is highlighted here. But these types of behaviors are typical of just about any type of motion adaptive deinterlacer, and the fact that the RetroTINK 5X can pull this off in its zero lag mode is honestly just blowing our minds. Even the weird off-spec 480i multiplayer mode in Sonic 2 works just fine. From another perspective, the most important feature of the RetroTINK 5X might be its worry-free compatibility. Many people have been gun-shy about buying an OSSC because they're worried it might not work with their TV or capture card. This is because the OSSC's lag-free operation makes it beholden to the vertical refresh of the console is connected to. And as a result, systems that have quirky analog characteristics like the NES and SNES just don't work as well with certain displays, especially when using higher resolution output modes. But the RetroTINK 5X has a failsafe against this, thanks to the optional buffer mode. The on-screen display calls this vertical sync, and it determines how frame timings are generated. Out of the box, triple buffer mode is engaged by default because it's the most highly compatible. Triple buffering is basically the RetroTINK 5X's signal to the TV that it gets to lead the dance. That means frames will be output at a consistent 60 frames per second to keep the display or capture card happy, but they will step on each other's toes periodically. This results in frames being dropped or duplicated several times each minute depending on the speed of the console, which is typically just a bit above or below 60 Hz. The likelihood that you'll actually notice any given frame hitch is probably fairly low, but some people will naturally be more sensitive to it than others. Thanks to triple buffering and the extremely on-spec 720p and 1080p output modes, there's almost no way the RetroTINK 5X won't work with your equipment. Triple buffering is also great because it might help with capturing VHS tapes, which frequently drop sync on some analog to digital converters. I've run some tapes that were in really bad shape through the RetroTINK 5X, and it simply never drops the picture. However, you've got nothing to lose by at least trying the other vertical sync setting, called frame lock. This is essentially like how the OSSC and RetroTINK 2X series work. In this mode, the console is the conductor, and your display, capture card, and RetroTINK all make beautiful music together, if they can keep up. The frame timings are determined by the console, which in the case of the NES and SNES are just barely over 60 Hz, while most other consoles run just a hair under 60 Hz. In our experience, if you get a picture from an SNES while it's set to frame lock mode, then just about anything else should work too. So if you can swing it, frame lock mode is the way to go because it offers the most consistent low lag experience. On Try's 1440p monitor, he used the time sleuth to determine the screen's baseline lag, which seems to be around 2.5 milliseconds with any input resolution. For reference, one frame at 60 frames per second lasts 16 milliseconds. So 2.5 milliseconds is functionally zero lag. In frame lock mode, 240p, 480i, and 480p add about 1 to 2 milliseconds or so of delay, which is still so far under 16 milliseconds that the result is no perceptible lag. If you do use the triple buffer mode, the lag becomes variable, but based on our tests, seems to never be more than about 18 milliseconds over the screen's baseline latency. It's possible this sawtooth latency pattern could be a problem for high-level competitive players, but the average person shouldn't be too worried if they need to use triple buffering for TV or capture card compatibility. Oh, and by the way, frame lock mode is forced for 480p and HD input signals, since the consoles that support higher resolutions aren't quite as creative with their timings as older 240p consoles. This way, you'll always get the best experience possible if you're using 480p output from systems like the Dreamcast, PS2, GameCube, Xbox, and Wii. Alright, here's another big one. The RetroTINK 5X represents a rare solution to what we call the Chrono Cross problem. You know how this one goes, right? 240p gameplay plus 480i in-game menus equals rampant sync drops. Apart from emulating or just using a CRT, the GBS control offered one of the first serious solutions to the problem, and we're happy to report that the RetroTINK 5X is right there with it. As you might expect, the triple buffer mode makes it so that you'll never again miss a second of the action when opening 480i menus in games like Chrono Cross, Silent Hill, and Dino Crisis. You might catch an ugly frame here and there during a transition, but it's a small price to pay for these games being simply playable again. Other games that benefit include the N64 version of Resident Evil 2, the Saturn version of Symphony of the Night, as well as a number of games from that generation that feature 480i title screens. Frame lock mode will likely give you an audio hitch during resolution transitions, so if you're playing a game where this could be a problem, you'll probably just want to switch to triple buffer mode. There are other situations where resolution doesn't necessarily change, but some other signal interruption occurs during a scene transition. Die Hard Arcade on Saturn is a pretty infamous example, where a drop occurs between every single screen transition. But there's even games on the Sega Genesis, including several Konami games like Castlemania Bloodlines, which can lose sync on other devices during the map sequence between levels. Situations like these, as well as resolution switching, are overall uncommon when considering the entire libraries for these systems, but it's nice to finally have tools like the RetroTINK 5X and the GBS control that can handle them with minimal interruptions. There are a couple of incompatibilities and hiccups that bear mentioning. If you have the most recent version of the G-SCART switch incorporated into your setup, enabling Dip Switch 3 for Sega Master System correction seems to break compatibility with a number of systems using RGB, when the RetroTINK 5X is set to frame lock mode. I ran into it with Saturn games that were using 240p, the Super Graphics when the Super SD System 3 was attached, and all N64 games. I nearly went crazy trying to figure out what the problem was. Of course, now, the Master System doesn't work all that great in frame lock mode, so you might just want to stick with triple buffer if you're using a real SMS, or you can just use a Genesis with a Power-Based Mini or something. Some of the more esoteric video mods gave me trouble. Specifically, my 3DO with the 240p RGB mod had glitchy video in games that used the full vertical resolution, such as Gex. Ones that don't, like Alone in the Dark, are fine in 240p mode with this mod, but do have issues at 480i when motion adaptive deinterlacing is enabled. If you absolutely gotta play some 3DO, I'd just stick with the stock S video for the time being. Seamless resolution switching isn't the only way that the RetroTINK 5X attempts to bring back features that, until recently, seemed impossible without a CRT. One bonus feature that we unfortunately can't test is compatibility with the Sinden Lightgun, which uses a white border to track gunplay on digital displays. Our understanding is that the Sinden Lightgun is primarily used with emulators, but can be adapted for use on original hardware. It might be interesting if a similar feature could be implemented in the future to create a black border for hiding the Sega Genesis overscan. A feature that Mike currently considers to be experimental is the 240p downscale. I just spent an entire episode on downscaling HD games to 240p with the GBS control, so we're not going to go too crazy here. But the short version of it is this. The RetroTINK 5X will convert any 480i, 480p, or 720p input to 240p, which you can then use on a CRT via an HDMI to analog converter. Unfortunately, we found that 480i looked rather flickery, which sort of defeats the purpose, but 480p and 720p look really clean. And in fact, downscaling from 720p is something that I was not able to do with the GBS control, which opens up a whole host of possibilities, like downscaling the Xbox Series X or PlayStation 5, neither of which offer 480p in their system menus. It might seem like a pointless exercise, and well, admittedly, it kind of is, but you might just think it's pretty neat. Just be sure that the 240p downscale is turned on before you connect your CRT. We can't promise that a high-resolution signal won't do something bad to it. If you endeavor to downscale from a modern HDMI-only console, you'll need two HDMI to component transcoders. One that can transcode your console of choice to component so that the 5X has something to work with, and another to transcode the HDMI output from the TINK to a CRT. These devices should add no more than a fraction of a frame of lag to your overall chain. I can't overstate enough that just because the RetroTINK 5X can downscale 720p to 240p doesn't mean there's going to be a magic bullet for some of these games to look good at this resolution. Yes, it fixes some games that had weird aspect ratios at 480p, such as Blazing Chrome on the Switch, but uneven scaling is uneven scaling, and nothing is going to fix that. The Tink does offer some nice features that improve upon the overall downscaling experience, such as being able to shift the image up and down so that it lines up with the scan lines of the display a bit better. The other big one is the aspect ratio adjustment, which will unsqueeze a 16:9 image and keep it from looking too skinny on a 4:3 display. However, the downside to this is that some vital information and gameplay could be pushed into the overscan. In some games, you might have to tinker with the in-game aspect ratio to get the desired results, such as with the games on the Mega Man Legacy Collection 2. Previous RetroTINK products have continued to receive updates and new features based on user feedback, and we're optimistic that Mike will do the same with the RetroTINK 5X. Updating is extremely easy to do over USB with a PC and the RetroTINK updating software, which can be found alongside firmware files on the RetroTINK blog. Who knows what the future could bring? I'm sure that everyone's going to be asking for additional optimized modes, but what else could we possibly get? More scanline settings with brightness compensation? 720p scaling? Super Nintendo deblur? Maybe some of these aren't even possible, but you never know. The OSSC has received many features over the years that were once thought to be impossible, so the RetroTINK 5X could also have more surprises yet to come.
As we always like to say, no one should feel like their FrameMeister OSSC or RetroTINK 2X are now obsolete. Just like with old games, if it was good when it was new, it doesn't suddenly become bad because a few years or a few decades passed. The OSSC in particular has been a major organ of classic gaming for the past half-decade. And while some people will be completely replacing it with the RetroTINK 5X, I do still have some uses for my OSSC, and I'll be grafting it onto another part of my setup even as the RetroTINK 5X becomes the new heart. And the OSSC and RetroTINK 2X devices will continue to be smart purchases for someone's core scalar unit, depending on their budget and setup needs. And likewise for the upcoming OSSC Pro and Pixel FX Morph, both of which scaling nerds like us are beyond excited to try out, but we also expect them to be pretty pricey and we don't know when they'll release. So I get it, all of the choices and considerations may seem overwhelming since all three are virtually guaranteed to completely rock the retro scene. So here's what I'll say about Mike Chi's work, and perhaps it'll help you decide what's right for you. The thing about Mike's products that has always made me smile is that they're just so gosh darn down to earth and practical. He works very hard to give you a high degree of connectivity and performance for the cost, and the 5X is on a whole new level of performance, the likes of which we've never seen jammed into one scaler before. If this were the very last scaler of its kind that was ever released, I don't think I'd have some big regret about gotta have it features that were forever out of reach. But of course I do have dreams for how I'll use the VGA input on the OSSC Pro, and I am very curious about the HDMI input on the Pixel FX Morph. These three devices will flourish and live in harmony, and I don't think it's a big competition for which one's gonna be the #1 best. But the RetroTINK 5X is here now, we know what it costs, and it offers a lot, more than fulfilling the needs of, I suspect, a majority of original hardware enthusiasts. It is one of the best devices of any kind that we've ever had the pleasure of testing, with virtually perfect performance complemented by a smart and easy to use feature set that serves nearly every console to the fullest. We look forward to using it and recommending it for a very long time. For now, Mike Chi has definitely earned a rest, but we can't wait to see what he does next.